Now, hello and welcome to the second part of this two-part tutorial where I want to talk about references in Unity. Now we're going to discuss three of the more important techniques that you can use to access different scripts. And those are, firstly, the most basic one that I'm sure you already know, which are just public variables. Secondly, we're going to look at the method find object of type and find object of tag and so on. And lastly, I want to show you how you can initialize an instantiated object with the references that you need them for. So before we can get started talking about references in Unity, we need to make sure we're talking about the same stuff. So let me just explain what is the difference between normal value type variables and reference type variables. Now it's not clear if you start working with C# what exactly the difference is, because it doesn't display it to you in any way. However, it's absolutely important to get it if you want to become a better programmer. So I've prepared this extremely high quality piece of educational content that you can see here in my Paint file. And yeah, you can see here I've already created different variables and different objects here. And the way these two types work is like the following. All the basic data types like integer, float, bool, and so on, they are value types, which means that they store a value. For example, I could store the value 1 within the integer x, or I don't know, 2.3. Yeah, I've got huge mouse skills, so this is like a comma here. So it's a comma separated value. Okay, so the values are stored directly in the variable. This is how we've learned how variables work. However, there are exceptions to this rule, and they are not that rare. Now, as I already said, the basic data types are value types. However, if we have more complex data types, like for example game objects or transforms, or every object that you create with a new statement, every class you create, these are so-called reference types. And a reference type works different. It doesn't store the value of the variable directly. Instead, it kind of stores a link to the variable, okay? You can imagine it like a hyperlink in the web. If you click on a hyperlink, the hyperlink itself just leads you to the actual website, okay? So this is usually described with an arrow. So if I say, for example, a reference to a game object into this GO variable here, you can imagine it like this GO variable points to this game object. In C++, there's even a construct called pointer. However, we're not going to talk about this right here because we're in C# and we're not going that deep, okay? But we need to understand that here is not the value saved, but instead a pointer to the place in the memory where the actual value is stored. Now you might think, well, this is just complicated. What could I possibly gain from this? This is just so much more complicated than directly saving the value in here. Why would anyone do something complicated like this? Now, the benefit comes when you don't just have one variable that references this game object, but if you have two variables that reference the same game object. Now imagine you have one enemy in your game, okay? And you have, for example, the player and the pet of the player, and both attack the same enemy. If you use references, they both have a reference to the same object, okay? So if GO2 changes this object, it also changes for GO1 or the normal GO, okay? Because there is only one instance, only one object there. If I had a value type that stores the game object, I would have two separate enemies in my game, okay? And there would be no real way to change this. So that's why we need references, okay? So we can access one object from different parts of our game. And it goes even further. Now let's say we have this transform, okay? Let's say this transform references to this thing here. And we also have the game object where GO1 and GO2 reference to, and this game object also has a reference to a transform which is the same one, for example, okay? And we could also have a reference to an enemy that could stand here. And only here then stand the real values. For example, for the X a 1, here a 2, and here a 3, and it has, I don't know, 7 HP or something. I know you can't almost read it. It's not that important what's in here. Important is that we understand that references can be imagined like pointers to something, okay? So I like to think of them as kind of hyperlinks, okay? So if I click onto this geo, it links me to here. And this is what you probably have already used in Unity. Now let's look at our player controller. Our player controller has this text variable, okay? And it's used to save the score, and I've already set it. And now look what happens if I just press it once. It highlights the game object where the script is at. So that way I already know this variable references to this text script. And I could have 15 variables referenced to the same text. And if one of them changes it, it changes for every one of them. That's the main benefit of having those reference type variables. Good. So now we've already discussed the first way to reference another script, and that is by just creating a public variable. I'll just do this again. So if I remove this, I just need to have a public variable. And if it's a game object, a transform, a text, or any Unity class that there is, and you save it and go back to Unity, you should see in the inspector a field that says there's none in here. And then you can drag an object in here and you have a reference to this object. That's the easiest way to create a reference. However, this is very limited and it has a few downsides too. Now watch what happens when I open this and I change this variable name. Let's change it to something stupid and go back to Unity. Yeah, I mean, that wasn't that smart of me because I used the variable down here, so I need to change it in here too. Go back to Unity. Now it should compile. And the reference is gone. And that's a huge problem. Okay, so every time I change a variable name, it destroys all the references that you have here. And that's a problem. So I am going to change it back to the way it was, and yeah, then I need to set it again. Now you might say, now, well, it's not that big of a deal. I mean, you just need to drag it in here again. What's the big problem? Okay, so imagine you have a big game like, I don't know, Pillars of Eternity, World of Warcraft, whatever, and you have, for example, I don't know, an enemy that occurs at 500 different parts of your game. And now you need to set all those 500 references again. Now have fun with that. That's going to be a really funny day for you. And you're going to make so many errors doing that. You're going to sit weeks probably just fixing the bugs you create when you need to do this. So this is probably not the safest way to do this. Don't get me wrong, for very simple things, for quick prototypes, you're absolutely fine doing this. But I usually try not to use them too much. Okay, so now let's talk about the next problem we have with this approach. Now let's go, for example, to our prefab. And in here, this point, so this is one of those score point bubble things that you need to collect. This needs a reference to the player that it should move to. Okay, I can do that. So let's just take the player and drag it in here, but it won't work. Well, that's strange. I mean, if I instantiate it in here and drag it around a bit, and I drag the player in here, it works. Okay, now let's remove it again. Click on the prefab and try to drag the player in again. And now it doesn't work. What the heck? So why would it work in such a strange way? Because if I instantiate it here, it works, but in the prefab, it doesn't work. Okay, that's strange. Now, if you think about it, it makes sense that you can't do this. Now, I only have one scene here, but imagine you have a second scene. If you have a second scene where you use the same prefab, you can't reference a player from the first scene because usually there's only one scene open at the same time. So that doesn't make any sense. And that's the second problem we have with those public variable references. I can't insert a reference to player 1 from this scene because from a prefab, you can never reference something inside of a scene. You can only reference from scene objects to other scene objects or to prefabs, but you can't reference from prefabs to scene objects. Okay? Well, that's another limitation that hits us hard. And now we're going to look at how we can work around this limitation. So now let me show you the second way how you can create references. Now let's go into this point script, and we set it to public, but it doesn't help us if it is public anyway. So let's try to find a references to a player from code. Now there's a bunch of ways, a bunch of things that we can do here. And whoopsie, I forgot to remove this part of the code, and we're going to look at that later. And the first thing that we could do is to set this references here in code. So I say player go equals, and then there's a method that's called find object of. Then you can see there are a bunch of methods, and what I usually use is find object of type, and then I can say in those pointy brackets what kind of object I'm looking for. So I want to find the player controller and save it in this player go script. Now I used this as a game object, so I find the player controller script and use the game object that's where the script is on. Okay, that already works. I'm going to fix up two things right after we see that it should work. Now if I hit play, these balls spawn and all move toward the first player, or actually it's the second player, which is kind of funny. But if you think about it, it's also clear why this happens. We have two players. You see here we have player controller 1 and we have player controller 2. And we just grab a player controller and it just uses the first one that it finds. And you should always assume it's a random one of those two, even if it's now player 2. If I probably change here the order, maybe it's player 1. I'm not sure, but it's still player 2. But it's really random. You shouldn't rely on it being player 2. But for now we have this reference, okay? And this works really well for objects that just exist once in your game. Okay, so that way you can get a reference to an object that exists just once within your game. Now, if you have multiple instances of an object in your game that you want to find, for example, you want to find all the player controllers, you can use find objects of type. And that way you can see this returns an array of player controllers. And that way you get all the player controllers in your game, and then you have to decide which one you want to find. So this is one way to do this. But let me tell you another thing about this approach. Now, it works fine, okay, if you have only one player, for example, but it has a huge downside. Now, I did this in the update method now. And what this find_object_of_type does is it checks the whole hierarchy, and it checks this game object, is here a player controller on it, is here a player controller on it, and so on. And you can imagine that's not very performant. Now imagine you have a few hundred scripts doing this kind of action every frame. That's very bad. So one thing we can do to improve the performance of our game so it runs more smoothly is to cache this reference. So instead of doing this every frame, we just do it in the awake method. Now you can do it in the awake or in the start method. I really like to do it in the awake method because in the awake method I usually instantiate all the variables that belong to this script. And I mean it's not that simple, but yeah, in this case it would work. So I just do it once. I search for the player controller and I save it into this variable. Then I just use it in the update. That way we don't have to traverse the whole hierarchy of our Unity project every frame. So we save some performance, which is always nice. Good. That's one of the ways to do this. But as you saw here, we have still the problem. We have two players and we need to make the blue ones move to the right player and the orange ones move to the left player. So this might also not be the most perfect solution in this case. So let's look at the third way of doing references. And I'm going to remove this here now again, because the third way is like the manual way. And how I usually do this is I create a public void initialize method, and I want to initialize my player game object here. So I just say game object player go, and then I set my instance variable to the variable that I gave as a parameter here. Okay. That way it should work. However, I need to call this initialize variable somewhere. And now I could go to Unity back again, and I have these two spawners. And now I could say these two spawners, one spawns the orange points and the other one spawns the blue points. Now I could say these spawners already have a variable, namely a public game object target player. And when they spawn one of those points, they set this variable. So they would say from the newly spawned game object, I get the component, I called it point. And then I call the initialize variable, the initialize method, and I tell it to initialize with the target that is set in this point spawner. For example, here, the target player. And now if I go back here, I have here this point spawner, and the point spawner for the first player, whoopsie, should reference this guy, and the point spawner for the second player should reference this guy. And now the point spawners are responsible for initializing the prefabs that they instantiate. So if I hit now play, it should work. Yes, and you can see the points now go to the corresponding player. Now I've got some kind of error message here. Yeah, because that's because I forgot to set the score text of my player, and I played around earlier with this one here, so I need to set this one, and now this error should be gone also. And if I play now, my game should be really fine. Oh no, you saw half of what I did not, because it's my face is here. Okay. Oh man, I just realized that my face was down here in the inspector all the time. And yeah, so you may not have seen the stuff I did here, but it's very easy anyway. So, you know, if you have here these references, you just drag the item in here that you want to reference in this variable, okay? Very sorry this happened. It won't happen again, hopefully. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial series. Let me just recap what we did in this reference video. We first talked about how we can create very simple references with just a public variable and then drag and dropping the variable that you want to reference. Then we looked at find object of type. Now this has the advantage that you can rename the variable without fearing that all your references are gone. However, it has the disadvantage that if you use find object of type, it will only find the first instance of this object. So if you have 4 players, it will only find one of those 4 players, and it will be completely random which one of those 4 it is. So that's the downside of this approach. You can also use find objects of type, so find multiple objects of type. That way you get an array of all 4 players and then have to determine on your own which one you want to use. And the last thing we looked at is to sort of make the object that instantiates a prefab responsible for also setting its references correctly. Because you can't reference a scene object from a prefab. And that's a problem that many of the users that are rather new to Unity have and don't understand. I hope I could shed some light into this topic. And yeah, that's it for this video tutorial. We created a very, very small, very, very simple game. And I hope you're happy with that. And with that, I wish you the best of luck and goodbye.